What's up, guys? Nate here. Let's take a look at this very tricky strengthen the argument question. This is based on an actual official LSAT question that a ton of people struggle with. Almost everybody seems to get this question wrong. What I've done is I've changed some of the words around. I've changed some of the answer choices around to turn it into a totally new question, but logically it's the same as this official question, and if you can really master this question, you'll be in really good shape. So first of all, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel, Master LSAT, to see many more videos like this that will get you closer to scoring a 180 on the LSAT. So let's take a look. The question is a strengthen the argument question. It says, which of the following, if true, most strengthens the argument? So let's go ahead and read the argument and see if there's anything that needs to be strengthened. So it says a restaurant critic's review should help restaurant goers figure out whether or not they are likely to enjoy a restaurant. Therefore, Ken is clearly a better restaurant critic than Stephanie. There's our conclusion. Therefore, Ken is better at being a restaurant critic than Stephanie is. After all, how do I know that's true? Because after all, a person who is apt to enjoy a particular restaurant is a lot more likely to realize this by reading a review by Ken than a review by Stephanie, in spite of the fact that Ken is more likely to give a restaurant a negative review than a positive one. So basically what we were just told is that if you're going to enjoy a restaurant, you're more likely to realize that by reading a Ken review than by reading a Stephanie review. And therefore, Ken is a better restaurant critic. And that makes perfect sense, ostensibly, because the first sentence already told us that what is a restaurant critic's job? What should a restaurant critic's review accomplish? Well, it should help restaurant goers figure out whether they're going to like a restaurant or not. And it seems like Ken is better at doing that than Stephanie is. And therefore, this conclusion that therefore Ken is a better restaurant critic than Stephanie, doesn't that follow very well from this information? Well, the answer is there is something missing. And if you can really read between the lines here and notice what's missing, you'll make this question a heck of a lot easier for you, because you'll be able to predict what needs to be true to strengthen the argument. Because this is one of these arguments where they only gave you half the information that you need, right? What did we say? What makes a restaurant critic good at their job? According to sentence one, a restaurant critic's review should help restaurant goers figure out whether or not they're likely to enjoy a restaurant. And then what did we tell you about Ken versus Stephanie? We said Ken is better than Stephanie in one of those two things, right? It says a person who is apt to enjoy a particular restaurant is more likely to realize that by reading a Ken review than by reading a Stephanie review. So that gave me half the story, right? That gave me half of what I need to know if I'm comparing the skill of Ken and Stephanie at being a good restaurant critic, right? But if you're really reading carefully, if you're really reading every single word, you'll notice it says whether or not they're likely to enjoy a restaurant, which means to be a master restaurant critic, you have to tell me if there's a restaurant that I'm going to enjoy. I have to be able to figure that out by reading your review. And if there's a restaurant that I'm not going to enjoy, I have to also be able to figure that out. That would make you an excellent restaurant critic. We know that Ken is better than Stephanie in one of those two things, but what about the flip side? That's the missing information, right? So if you're reading really carefully, if you're reading between the lines, you can predict the answer here, that the answer is probably going to tell us that not only is it true that if you're going to enjoy a restaurant, you're more likely to realize that by reading Ken than by reading Stephanie, but also if you're not going to enjoy a restaurant, you're also more likely to realize that by reading Ken than by reading Stephanie. That would really seal the deal. That would hit the nail in the coffin. That would really prove this conclusion that Ken is therefore definitely 100% a better restaurant critic than Stephanie. And here's the kicker, is that that's the only thing that the answer could possibly be. That is the only thing that could strengthen the argument, because that's the only missing hole here, right? According to the premise in the first sentence, right, if we're assuming that the premise is true, which we always have to on every LSAT question, it tells us that if a restaurant critic's review should help restaurant goers figure out whether or not they're likely to enjoy a restaurant. That is the job of a restaurant critic. So that's the metric that you can measure how good a restaurant critic is, right? According to this paragraph, that's the premise given, right? So any answer choice that tells you something else that's good about Ken that doesn't necessarily have to do with that is not going to help us out here, right? This information in the first sentence, this is the only criteria that we know of that makes a good restaurant critic. This is what a restaurant critic's review should accomplish, right? And we already know that 50% of that, Ken is better than Stephanie. So to strengthen the argument, we need to know the other 50% that Ken is also better at making you realize you're not going to enjoy a restaurant. Anyway, let's look at the answer choices one by one and see if we can find that. Would A strengthen the argument? A says reading a restaurant review by Ken will tend to cause you to enjoy the restaurant more than you otherwise would have. Now that sounds great, right? If you ask me, that's awesome, right? If you're going to enjoy the food more. But according to this paragraph, that's not what makes you a good restaurant critic, right? According to this paragraph, a restaurant critic, what makes you a good restaurant critic is if you help people realize whether they're going to enjoy a restaurant or not. So A says it causes you to enjoy the food more. That's not the same thing, right? Let's put it this way. It might even be bad. What if you read a review by Ken that makes you think you're not going to enjoy the restaurant, but reading the review makes you enjoy the restaurant? Then, according to this paragraph, that's actually a bad restaurant review, because then he tricked you into thinking you weren't going to enjoy it, but then he caused you to enjoy it. I think you see what I'm saying, that it's not the same thing. Causing you to enjoy the restaurant is not the same thing as making you figure out whether or not you are likely to enjoy it, right? So this is a little bit of a trick. It's not exactly according to the paragraph, right? The paragraph already told you what makes a good restaurant critic, what a restaurant critic's review is. So anything else that seems like it's ostensibly good about Ken's reviewing, but it's not what the paragraph told us that we need to look for, is not going to actually make him a better reviewer. Now, B is a tricky answer that for some reason, the equivalent of B on the actual official LSAT question that this is based off of is the answer that everybody picks. B says most of the restaurants that Ken reviews are also reviewed by Stephanie. That's neither here nor there, because it could be that Ken reviews only, I don't know, Chinese restaurants and Stephanie only reviews American fast food restaurants. It's neither here nor there, right? Whether they review the same restaurants or totally different restaurants has nothing to do with their skill as a critic, right? The question is, are you likely to find out whether you're going to enjoy that restaurant from reading Ken's review versus from reading Stephanie's review? That's the pertinent information here. It doesn't matter which restaurants each one reviews, whether they review the same ones or they review different ones. It's irrelevant. The question is, if I'm going to go to a restaurant that one of these people wrote a review on, how likely is that review to tell me whether I'm going to enjoy it or not? And therefore, it doesn't matter whether they review the same restaurants or different restaurants, whether B is true or false. It has no impact on the truth of this argument. Now, C is telling me something that seems to be better about Ken. C says Ken has professional experience with cuisine, whereas Stephanie is merely a casual foodie. Now, here's the thing. Even though, kind of like A, this is telling me something new that kind of sounds like it's better with Ken than with Stephanie. But according to the paragraph, this is not what makes you a good restaurant critic. The paragraph told you, here's what makes you a good restaurant critic. It told you in sentence 1, it says a restaurant critic's review should help you figure out whether or not you're likely to enjoy a restaurant. That's the job of a restaurant critic. So telling me that Ken is, I don't know, if you told me that Ken is better looking than Stephanie, that clearly wouldn't strengthen this argument. If you told me that Ken has more college degrees than Stephanie, that would not strengthen this argument, because neither of those things are shown to be relevant to being a good restaurant critic in the information that we know. Remember, when you take the LSAT, you have to assume that the only thing you know, everything in the world that you know about being a restaurant critic, is all in this paragraph. And therefore, there's no evidence that C is going to make you a better restaurant critic, any more than knowing that Ken is better looking or has more college degrees than Stephanie, or any other miscellaneous fact that you can think of comparing Ken with Stephanie. There's no evidence that any of those things would tell you that Ken is a better restaurant critic, and therefore C doesn't help us get closer to our conclusion. Now D, let's read D. D says one who is unlikely to enjoy a particular restaurant is more likely to realize this by reading a review by Ken than a review by Stephanie. Remember, we said that's exactly what we're looking for. That's exactly the missing link here, right? According to the paragraph, again, we keep going back to this first line of the paragraph because that's really the premise, but it says a restaurant critic's review should help you figure out whether or not you're likely to enjoy a restaurant. Now, the paragraph told us that if you are apt to enjoy a particular restaurant, then you're more likely to realize that by reading a Ken review. And D tells you that if you're unlikely to enjoy a restaurant, you're also more likely to realize that by reading a review by Ken. And therefore, D is giving you the other 50% of the information that you need to know to strengthen the argument. And therefore, D is exactly true. It's exactly what we're looking for. It's what we could have known. Again, if we read the paragraph very closely, you can possibly know to predict D here. And let's put it another way. If D were false, that would ruin the argument. Let's say one who is unlikely to enjoy a particular restaurant, let's say it's the other way around. Let's say you're more likely to realize that by reading a review by Stephanie than by Ken. Well, that would totally negate the whole argument, because then it's a tie, right? Then it's like if you're going to enjoy a restaurant, then you're better off with Ken. But if you're not going to enjoy a restaurant, you're better off with Stephanie. So then they tie each other. Then they're kind of the same, potentially, right? So that would ruin the argument. So D, by making D true, you really seal the deal. You really hit the nail in the coffin, and you prove 100% that Ken is better in both ways. And therefore, that proves the conclusion that Ken is clearly a better restaurant critic than Stephanie. So that's exactly what we were looking for. And finally, E, most of Stephanie's reviews take a negative review of the restaurant being reviewed. This is just meant to distract you. This has nothing to do with whether she's a good reviewer or not. It has certainly nothing to do with whether Ken's a good restaurant critic or not, and it doesn't compare the two of them. The fact that most of the time she takes a negative view kind of sounds like Ken is also more likely to give a restaurant a negative review than a positive one, right? It says this in the last line of the paragraph. So if you tell me that's true of Stephanie, also most of Stephanie's reviews are also negative, okay, that's kind of neither here nor there. The question is, at the end of the day, once I finish reading the review, which one of these two people is more likely to tell me whether I am or am not going to enjoy the restaurant, right? So if it happens to be that most of Stephanie's reviews are of bad restaurants that she takes a negative view of or that she just doesn't like, or if the opposite of E were true, if most of them were a positive view, I don't see either way how that would impact whether we can determine her skill as a critic, right? So therefore, that's not going to get us any closer to our conclusion. It's just a distraction. So D, hopefully you can understand now why D is the correct answer here. Again, if you read very carefully, really between the lines here, you can predict D as the answer. But even if you don't, when you get down to it, you should read it. And even just a superficial reading of D, it's like, oh yeah, duh, that does sound like Ken is better, right? If you're unlikely to enjoy a restaurant, you're more likely to realize that by reading a review by Ken than a review by Stephanie. Well, according to the first sentence of the paragraph, that's the kind of thing that makes you a better restaurant critic. And therefore, D should strengthen the argument, and therefore Ken is a better restaurant critic than Stephanie. Okay, so that's it for now. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. And if there are any other official LSAT questions that you really struggle with that you want me to do a video like this for, be sure to let me know in the comments. And of course, to get a full regimen for how to score 180 on the LSAT, you're definitely going to want to head over to masterlsat.com. In the meantime, I will see you in the next video. If you found this video useful, don't forget to hit subscribe. And for thousands more clear LSAT explanation videos, go to masterlsat.com.